Sox notwithstanding. So welcome to the fourth in our series of contributions to the Church in the 21st Century initiative this year. And I want especially, before I begin, to tell you something about why the Lonergan Workshop happens to invite this strange beast, Garrett Fitzgerald. When I was a student in Europe, I got a habit of reading international papers. And one of the ones that the habit stuck with is the Irish Times. And he writes each Saturday a column in the Irish Times. And I realized that this is a person who doesn't talk like Lonergan did about being attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible. He just acts that way consistently. And that's an extraordinary blessing for the world, certainly for Ireland, and tonight for us. And it was an added blessing that when Sue heard him speak at the Irish Studies a couple of years ago, he asked whether his mother knew Helen Waddell, and he said, no, but my niece is a Helen Waddell scholar. So before I introduce our introducer, I wanted to continue the tradition of the Lonergan Workshop of giving weird gifts. This one is Hopes and Dreams, and it has to do with the immense labor, really an overwhelming labor of assembling the data and sorting it out on Helen Waddell that Jennifer has been involved with and hopes to bring to fruition before her scholarly career ends. So, hopes and dreams for Jennifer. Just so you know the person you didn't get to hear the first one. The next gift might be a curse. It is the fact that Lonergan was very interested in political theology, and he thought what political theologians lacked was any understanding of economics. And therefore, after having worked as a young man consistently in his spare time for 14 years on economics, when he returned to BC in the late 70s and early 80s, he returned to economics. And he took up a text that he'd let go in the early 40s. There was a succession of drafts, and those earlier drafts of his economic ideas are collected in this work called For a New Political Economy, edited by Philip McShane, another crazy Irishman. But this other volume, Macroeconomics, Dynamics, an Essay in Circulation Analysis, really tries to bring together the advances Lonergan made during his time here at BC, and that was edited by my colleagues Charles Heffling and Pat Byrne and myself. So we wanted to present Garrett with these, but we won't burden him with them now. I'll keep them for him. There you are, more baggage. We had learned a lot about how important Garrett has been for the history of Ireland from our colleague, Father Ray Helmick. And I had asked Ray to introduce our speaker, and he is unable to do so tonight because he's in Minneapolis. So I said, well, who'd be the best person to do it? And Ray said the best person to do it would be Bob O'Neill. So I'm welcoming Bob O'Neill.
Thank you, Fred. When I arrived this evening, I saw Garrett busily editing his speech, and he said he was fearful that it was too long. And I said, well, that makes me feel better because I've only written 20 pages of introduction, so I'll keep it very brief. It's a special pleasure to welcome back Garrett Fitzgerald to Boston College. He has been a frequent and most welcome visitor especially, I might add, to the Burns Library, where he's offered seminars and lectures on a number of occasions. I use the word Garrett because in Ireland and everywhere, it's a name of affection. He is universally loved, a tribute few politicians can claim. And in addition to being a very distinguished politician, he is an economist, a professor, a media commentator, author, Chancellor of the National University of Ireland, and two-term Taoiseach, our Prime Minister of Ireland. Garrett is perhaps best known as a statesman and political leader who, as Taoiseach in 1985, helped engineer the Anglo-Irish Agreement, one of the watershed moments in the history of Ireland, especially Northern Ireland. Dr. Fitzgerald first made his mark as an economist, however, becoming an authority in the field of economics of transport and national planning. He served as a lecturer in economics at University College Dublin and earned his PhD in economics in 1969. Following in the footsteps of his father, Desmond Fitzgerald, one of the founders of the Irish Free State, Garrett joined the political party Fine Gael and in 1965 was elected to the Irish Senate. 4 years later, he was elected to the Dáil Éireann and became his party's spokesperson on finance. In 1973, the same year Ireland became a member of the European Economic Community, Garrett became Minister of Foreign Affairs in Liam Cosgrave's coalition government with Labour. He gained international respect in this position, especially during Ireland's presidency of the European Council in 1975, and his popularity at home soared. In 1977, he succeeded Liam Cosgrave as leader of Fine Gael. Dr. Fitzgerald's personal popularity and energetic campaigning quickly reinvigorated Fine Gael, and in 1981, Fine Gael with Labour formed a new government. Garrett was elected Taoiseach. He served as Taoiseach from 1981 to 1982, and again from 1982 to 1987. These were challenging years, economically, socially, and politically in Ireland. His efforts to liberalize Irish society and introduce economic reforms met with stiff resistance. But perhaps the most challenging issue facing his government was Northern Ireland. Peace in Northern Ireland was an issue of great personal interest to him. In his memoir, All in a Life, he tells the story of how, as a young child of 4 or 5 years old, he made a derogatory comment about the Protestant religion and a Protestant family friend. His mother responded quietly, "You do know that I am a Protestant too, dear, don't you?" He did not. This lesson taught him life was more complex than he had thought at the tender age of 5, and he has never forgotten this lesson. We at Boston College have been especially privileged that over the past 2 decades, he has honored us with many visits, speaking and lecturing on a wide range of topics from the peace process in Northern Ireland to the European Union. Tonight, he will speak on church, culture, and education in Ireland and the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much, Bob. The facts are accurate. The praise was excessive. I shall confine my remarks to the state of the Catholic Church in the Republic of Ireland, although, of course, the institutional Catholic Church, like others in our island, is organised on an all-Ireland basis. The situation of the Church in Northern Ireland, where its adherents constitute a 44% minority of the population, in a strongly polarised relationship with the 56% Protestant majority, is necessarily different from that in the Republic. In respect of Northern Ireland, I shall therefore confine myself to saying, remarking that possibly because of this religious polarization, the recent decline in the practice of religion by Catholics and the changes in the relationship between laity and institutional church may perhaps have been less marked there than has been the case in the Republic. Although I lectured in the economics school of my university, I am by training and inclination a historian. So please forgive me if I preface my remarks with a brief historical introduction. The Irish Catholic Church has, after all, a unique history. For Ireland is the only country in Europe, and I think in the Western world, where for 4 centuries there was an absolute disjunction between its government and the vast majority of its population. By the mid-17th century, throughout Europe, the principle of cuius regio, eius religio had come to prevail. After the wars of religion, rulers and peoples found themselves in the mid-17th century broadly in harmony with each other. There were, of course, religious minorities in many states, in some cases tolerated, in others repressed. But only in Ireland was the government in the hands of a small religious minority of about 15%, who were organised as an established church, holding in its care, as remains the case today, all the surviving church buildings of the previous millennium, so the vast majority of the people were left without anywhere to hold religious services, which were in fact banned in the early 18th century. The construction of Catholic churches came to be tolerated during the course of the 18th century, but it was only after 1820 that their size ceased to be limited by a provision restricting their roofing to straw. The Anglican minority was moreover intent on all property being owned by their adherents. By 1775, no less than 95% of the land of Ireland had come into Anglican hands, either by confiscation in the 17th century or in the 18th by legally transferring inherited family property to any son of a Catholic family prepared to adopt the Anglican faith. And after 1691, the Catholic majority in the island were moreover deprived of all leadership, lay or religious. Their princes went into exile, and the Catholic clergy were banned. Dissenters also suffered from repression, but in the 19th century, Protestant solidarity in support of the political union with Britain, together with a fear shared by Presbyterians with Anglicans about the recovering political influence of the Catholic majority, led them into a political consensus with the Anglican establishment in favour of the maintenance of the union with Britain that had been effected in 1801. However, the system of Anglican supremacy could not last indefinitely. And during the century ending about 1880, most of its structures were gradually dismantled by the British authorities, and it was legally disestablished in 1869 to 1871. However, the small, although today, through immigration, rapidly growing, Protestant minority in the Republic remained disproportionately wealthy and influential. Even today, Protestants in the Irish state retain a favoured position. In 1991, 40% of Protestants were in the top 3 socioeconomic groups, whereas that was still true of only 19% of Roman Catholics. Now, that brief historical introduction is not designed to air old grievances. Today, relations in the different churches and their flocks in the Republic are positive and indeed very warm. To the point where on Easter Sunday in Drogheda, an Anglican clergyman can celebrate Mass for 3 priests in the Catholic Church, where a number of his flock receives Holy Communion together with the Catholic congregation, an event that has evoked the displeasure, I have to say, of the Catholic and Anglican Archbishops of Armagh, in which diocese Drogheda finds itself. In the church where I attend Mass on Christmas Day, the woman pastor of the Presbyterian church nearby, who lent her church to the local priests when the Catholic Church was being repaired some time ago, comes each year at Christmas to greet the Catholic congregation, and our parish priest reciprocates in her church. They are but small examples of the warmth of the relationship that has emerged in particularly in the last 20 years or so. Nevertheless, it's still necessary to recall the historical background, really, in order to explain why it is that much of the structures of Irish society, especially in the education and health sectors, developed in the 19th century along denominational lines, and because of the force of inertia in society, have remained so divided right into the 21st century? Quite simply, when after about 1820 Catholics began to emerge from what are known in Ireland as the penal days, the Anglican monopoly of education and health services left Catholics little choice about constructing a parallel Catholic system, which has shown remarkable durability and has, in fact, greatly limited the role of the state in certain areas, especially in respect to school education. Although originally intended to be non-denominational, the largely state-funded primary education system, which, because of British concern to Anglicise the Irish people, was got underway in Ireland in the 1830s, well in advance of its launch in England, was quickly colonised by Catholics and Presbyterians and remains today almost wholly confessional. The confessional primary school system is now starting to pose a problem for the state, for an increasing proportion of parents today are seeking non-denominational, or in some cases multi-denominational, primary education. Don't ask what the difference is. It's a very subtle difference which led to one school having to leave because of the way he was trying to sort things out constructively. So there is some very important principle between being non- and multi-denominational. Nobody quite understands it. Amongst the recent list of new schools being built, only one was a Catholic school. Hitherto the problem has been coped with because it has arisen first in developing urban or suburban areas where the child population is rising against the general trend in the country. And where new schools are needed, they will now normally be non-denominational. Any new school is built. But as this trend spreads to more rural areas, where the child population is generally declining, a demand for separate non-denominational education will not be easy to meet. That's a situation that neither state nor Catholic Church have yet been prepared to address, or even perhaps to contemplate. And in the next 20 years, I think there will be many problems arising from that. During the 19th century, Catholics had to set up their own secondary schools to supplement the Anglican grammar schools. In 1878, these Catholic secondary schools secured state support, initially through a payment by results system applied to all secondary schools. And since the 1930s, these confessional secondary schools have been supplemented by a considerably smaller stream of less academic public local authority schools. Since the late 1960s, additional state finance for confessional schools has enabled almost all these private schools to match the public schools by offering free secondary education. Only about 30 secondary schools, almost all in South Dublin, are today fee-paying. We are very unusual in having free private and public education. I'm not sure it exists anywhere else, in fact. At third level, the formerly Anglican Dublin University, or Trinity College, now in practice non-denominational, was supplemented in the 19th and 20th centuries by non-denominational universities, which in 908 came under the umbrella of a new National University of Ireland, over the Senate of which I actively preside as Chancellor. The four constituent colleges of this National University are now universities in their own right. Within the National University, a kind of mystical relationship akin to the Blessed Trinity. Until the 1970s, these formerly non-denominational colleges of the NUI were, however, in practice under considerable Catholic Church influence. But since then, a reaction against that influence has returned them to their non-denominational roots, now tinged with a marked element of anti-clericalism that has arisen from their earlier unhappy experience of informal Catholic Church influence. Because of this historical background, there is, in fact, considerable resistance to the introduction of any kind of theology into these universities, even theology independent of Catholic Church control. However, in Dublin University, the former Anglican Divinity School has been transformed into a lively non-denominational school of religions and theology. And quite recently, a Jesuit Institute of Theology has been brought into association with the National University of Ireland as a recognised, rather than a constituent, college of the university. This institute appoints its own staff. And as I was at pains to point out in the presence of the nuncio when I presided last year at its inauguration, it will not accept a veto on its appointments by the Holy See, although it would be prepared to exempt any Roman Catholic clerical students from being taught by a lecturer or professor whose appointment the Holy See had disapproved. And several days ago I learnt, with great pleasure, that there is now a prospect of an independent school of theology, that is one not under ecclesiastical control, being endowed by a benefactor within University College Cork, although it is too soon to say how this proposal will be received by the staff of that university, who I think don't yet know about it. I should perhaps add that wishing to encourage independent theological study, free of church control, the final act I performed as Taoiseach 19 years ago, literally during my last hour in office, was to secure from my Attorney General and to communicate personally to relevant institutions a formal legal opinion that state grants to students of theology would not offend against the provisions of the Irish Constitution that preclude endowment of religion. And 10 years later, as a member of the Senate of the National University, I also secured the inclusion in the Universities Act of our Parliament of a provision deleting a clause of the British law of 908, which had effectively banned the teaching of theology in NUI colleges. Arising from these reforms, it now seems possible that state aid might become available in some form, not just for students of theology, which I secured 20 years ago, but also for the teaching of theology, independent of church control, possibly at postgraduate level, and especially if the institutions concerned were prepared to cooperate at that level. I've only just learned a couple of days ago of that possibility. Before moving on to wider aspects of the Catholic Church in Ireland, I should perhaps say that however odd this may seem to you in Boston College, the idea of a Catholic university would, in Ireland, seem very strange. I'd even say unacceptable to our modern Irish society, as would the teaching of theology under Catholic Church control outside of a seminary. Of course, in a country in which Catholics are in a minority, the idea of a Catholic university makes sense. But I invite you to understand that in a state where the great majority of the population are Catholic, it would appear to our people anomalous to have a specific Catholic university, or specifically Catholic university. When most people in the country come from a Catholic background, even though they may vary greatly in their commitment to the Church, Catholicism is in a way assumed by them, is not made explicit. Moreover, in a period of transition when people simply do not know the degree of each other's personal commitment to the Church, Catholic Church, or indeed by Protestants to their churches, to bring religion into discussion of public issues would, people feel, only create a confusion or embarrassment. Hence the paradox that precisely because of a largely common religious background, religion features much less overtly in Irish life than I think is the case in the United States, and is rarely present in public rhetoric. I know that some Americans visiting Ireland I find this overt religious neutralism strange. And that's why I felt necessary at this point to offer some explanation of the phenomenon. I would remark that in the course of many years in government, I can recall only one occasion in which a minister ever made reference to religion. I was proposing the introduction of a policy of development aid for the Third World. At the end of a cabinet meeting, only 7 people remained out of the 15. And the issue was finally decided when the minister said, for Christians at all we have to do this. And I won by 4 votes to 3. Let me, after a somewhat prolonged introduction, now turn to the present condition of the Catholic Church in Ireland. Most of those who founded the Irish state, and also those who challenged it in arms during the Civil War, immediately after its foundation, were pious and loyal Catholics. But, like others before them, they had not been prepared to accept church criticism of their use of violence for national political ends, and it has to be said many of them retained bitter memories of how the Catholic hierarchy had brought down Parnell in 1890 because of the controversy over his affair with Catherine O'Shea. Moreover, the structures of the Irish Catholic hierarchy, the strictures of the Irish Catholic hierarchy, directed at Republicans in the Civil War, strictures very strongly expressed in late 1922, alienated Republicans, and led some of them indeed to abandon the practice of religion for many years thereafter. So, although the political leaders of the new state were certainly influenced by their religion in some of the legislation, the introduction of censorship of films and books, the withdrawal of the limited form of parliamentary divorce that had existed under the British regime, they were nevertheless committed to establishing a non-sectarian state with fair treatment for the small Protestant minority who were accorded quite disproportionate representation in the first Senate of the Irish state. Thus, when in the late 1920s the first head of government, W.T. Cosgrave, faced strong episcopal opposition to the appointment of Protestants as dispensary doctors, that's public health doctors, he stood his ground, insisting that what he described as the constitutional position of the state must take precedence over the discipline of the Catholic Church, to use his words. He may indeed have won his point with the hierarchy by threatening resignation if they were to insist on pressing their point. At the same time, the opposition of Raymond de Valera were seeking to recover ground with the hierarchy after their rejection of its authority at the time of the Civil War. So they denounced the appointment of a Protestant woman as a public librarian in County Mayo. But Cosgrave refused to give ground on this because he said, and I quote, to discriminate against any citizen or exercise a preference for any citizen on account of religious belief would be to conflict with some of the fundamental principles upon which this state was founded. Moreover, around that time, the opposition also sought to please the hierarchy by criticizing the government for having bypassed the bishops when initiating diplomatic relations with the Holy See. Of course, such diplomatic relations was the last thing the bishops wanted, to have a nuncio in Ireland overseeing their activities. They've got used to it since. The original 1922 constitution of the new Irish state, which had to secure British approval for its adoption, was unambiguously non-denominational. But when in 1937 Mr. de Valera sought to replace the document with a new constitution, I can recall at the age of 11 attending one of the parliamentary debates in that constitution, he came under some pressure from the Catholic Church at home and from Rome to make Ireland a Catholic state. He met this pressure partly by giving the new constitution a Christian preamble, also by introducing a constitutional ban on divorce, and including current Catholic social principles, but in a non-justiciable form at the end of the document, on a basis that they couldn't be cited in the Supreme Court, but they were just put in rather vaguely. He also made a gesture of contemporary support for corporatism, then popular in Rome, by giving vocational bodies a partial role in nominating, but certainly not in electing, members of a weak Senate. But he was not prepared to declare Ireland a Catholic state, and he wanted to protect religious minorities, and in particular the Jewish community, with whose leader Rabbi Herzog, whose son Chaim Herzog later became President of Israel, he was particularly friendly with. He eventually extricated himself, quite ingeniously, from this potential conflict with the Catholic Church by devising a constitutional article that referred to all the main religions by their official names, suggested to him as a procedure by the Anglican Archbishop of Dublin, whilst recognising as a fact that most Irish people were Roman Catholics. Let me read you the clause. By the way, the name of the Catholic Church here is, we were told in 1937, the official name. I don't know if people know the official name of the Catholic Church. Some of you presumably do, but many don't. So I'll cite what's said. The state recognises the special position of the Holy Catholic, Apostolic and Roman Church as the guardian of the faith professed by the great majority of the citizens. The state also recognises the Church of Ireland, the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, the Methodist Church in Ireland, the Religious Society of Friends in Ireland, as well as the Jewish congregations and the other religious denominations existing in Ireland at the date of the coming into force of the Constitution. I think we may have been the first country anywhere to include the Jewish community in official recognition by the state. With some reluctance, the Holy See accepted this formulation. We will remain silent, was the response by Cardinal Pacelli, soon to be Pope Pius XII. And of course, without that silence, the Constitution would not have been adopted by the Irish people in a referendum. For many of them, for party political reasons, were suspicious of de Valera's motives in seeking to bring into force a new constitution, and opposition by Rome would have killed it. I should, by the way, add that 35 years later, this very subtle formulation had nevertheless come to be seen as giving the Catholic Church too big a role, and it was deleted from the Constitution by a majority of more than 5 to 1 in 1972, in a referendum in which the Cardinal said he wouldn't shed a tear for its removal. Nevertheless, although the idea of making the Republic of Ireland a Catholic state was consistently rejected by Irish politicians, they sometimes spoke of it loosely and confusingly as being a Catholic nation, and up to the 1950s at least, messages from Irish heads of government to the Pope would refer to the filial devotion of the government and people to the Holy See, words that sound very strange to us today. The fact is that there was often a good deal of confusion of mind on these matters amongst Irish people and politicians. Up at least to the early 1950s, many Irish politicians felt that as Catholics, they were bound to accept and to give effect to the teachings of the Church in social matters. Thus, in 1951, when the hierarchy opposed as being against Catholic teaching, a scheme to provide free maternity services, the government of the day felt obliged to abandon the scheme, although its successor, shortly afterwards under Raymond de Valera, later secured Church acceptance of such a scheme on the basis that a very small charge would be made for the services. But the Mother and Child Scheme debacle of 1951, which marked the high water mark of Catholic Church influence in Irish politics, proved to have been a Pyrrhic victory for the Irish Catholic hierarchy. During the years that followed, most, although for several decades not all, Irish politicians ceased to feel personally obliged to follow the views of the hierarchy on legislation, although as democratic politicians concerned to be re-elected, which you appreciate is something that remains in the mind of politicians very often, they naturally continue to have considerable regard for the views of the overwhelmingly Catholic electorate, many of whom remain strongly influenced by that Church's views on issues especially such as divorce, contraception and abortion. That second phase of Church-State relations in Ireland emerged in the 1960s and early 70s and continued until the 1990s. But during the last 10 or 15 years, this Church-State relationship entered a third phase, as the spectacular failure of the Irish hierarchy to address the clerical paedophile issue eventually led politicians with massive public support to face down the bishops on this matter. State investigations of such abuses have been taking place in several dioceses, one of them recently published, the Diocese of Ferns, and all dioceses are now subject to close state monitoring of church procedures in this matter. The state-church relationship has thus been radically and dramatically transformed. I come now to the issue of religious practice and of deference to the Church. Changes that took several centuries elsewhere have in Ireland all occurred within 4 recent decades. For since the 1960s, there has been a huge erosion of religious practice in Ireland, so much so that some now speak of a post-Christian Ireland. And last Sunday, the respected Archbishop of Dublin went so far as to use the adjective heathen to describe a large part of the Irish population, but it is evident that some young people simply have no knowledge whatever of Christianity. Overall weekly Mass attendance amongst Catholics has declined from over 90% to an estimated 50 to 60%, and in some suburban working-class areas of Dublin, to which families have been transplanted from older, more settled areas, it is down to between 5 and 10%. In rural areas, weekly Mass attendance remains quite high, of course, but there also it has fallen off. This process developed very rapidly during the 1980s and 90s, so that it was well advanced before the clerical paedophile issue emerged as a very major scandal about a decade ago. Come now to the role of Humanae Vitae. In 1935, contraceptives had been legally banned in Ireland, as I believe was also the case in Massachusetts. Can anybody confirm that? I right think they were banned until 1968. Am I wrong? Oh, I seem somebody nodded. Yes, so it wasn't just us. But around 1964, the pill was introduced in Ireland, and because it was used to regularise women's reproductive cycles, it was not banned. From then onwards, marital fertility started to decline quite rapidly and has since halved. However, with economic recovery in the 1960s, emigration dropped by 70%. And many of the rapidly increasing cohort of young people who as a result remained in Ireland instead of emigrating were getting married young. So that despite falling fertility rates, the birth rate actually rose by 1/4, until in 1980 a reversal of the upward marriage rate and a continuing fall in marital fertility led to a 30% drop in the birth rate over the following 14 years to 1994. We had the latest peaking of births in Europe because of the delay in regard to contraception. In Ireland as elsewhere, the publication of Humanae Vitae in July 1968 precipitated a certain crisis in the Church. Its earlier acceptance of the rhythm method, and later of Billings, was seen as having in principle validated efforts to space families and to halt reproduction in women's later 30s and 40s. And by and large, the married laity failed to accept the attempted distinction between natural and artificial contraception, natural in inverted commas. However, that development did not immediately lead to a significant fall in church attendance. At that time, that came later. For many of the Irish clergy came to share the laity's view of the encyclical and did not seek to enforce its teaching in the confessional. Thus, the negative consequences of Humanae Vitae were more long-term. What happened was its publication gradually came to erode the authority of the Church, thus starting a process through which increasingly the laity began to make up their own minds on issues in respect of which they had previously been prepared to accept, without question, the guidance of the Church. A few words on clerical paedophilia, I won't dwell on it. Human weaknesses amongst ministers of the Church are understood by the laity, who are conscious of their own moral frailty. But precisely because they are Christians, what lay members of the Church simply cannot, under any circumstances, accept is the adoption by Church leaders of double standards and cover-ups in respect of criminal activity, above all where this has involved the abuse of children. That aspect of institutional religion is at flagrant, indeed polar variance with Christian witness to the truth, and nothing is or can be more fatal to religion than hypocrisy amongst those whose role it is to proclaim and give such witness. I need not develop this point further in the city of Boston. However, I should perhaps add a new and very recent development, the last few weeks, has been the emergence of open conflict between clergy and hierarchy over what many of the clergy feel has been a failure by the bishops to protect the rights of innocent priests. At this stage, the unhappy bishops simply cannot win, and in a very difficult position. One only has to think how different would have been the handling of the paedophile issue within our Irish Church, or any other country's Catholic Church, had there been some women bishops in the hierarchy. They would not have tolerated for a moment the cover-up attitude adopted by most members of the all-male hierarchy, who would instead have insisted on the welfare of children coming before futile and dishonourable attempts to avoid scandal. And for those who may still find women bishops too big a step to contemplate, married bishops might be an interim step. If some of our bishops had in fact been married, they would have been guided by moral theology through their wives rather than by institutional protectionism. I wouldn't insist on abolishing celibacy of the clergy. Just start with the bishops. Since the 1960s, appointments to the Irish episcopacy, as to many other episcopacies, have increasingly come to be decided by the willingness of potential candidates to accept and defend Humanae Vitae. As a result, the intellectual level of the hierarchy has increasingly failed to keep pace with the rapidly rising educational level of the laity. From the 1970s onwards, the results of diocesan consultations with the clergy in Ireland on nominations to the hierarchy, and they take place every 3 years, have come to be so persistently ignored by Rome that it has almost seemed as if that process was being used simply in order to identify whom not to appoint. And that is widely believed to be the case. That appointment system has unhappily created something of a gulf between much of the laity, and indeed many of the clergy, and the hierarchy. However, the recent appointment of Diarmuid Martin as Archbishop of Dublin, a man with qualities of both leadership and intellect, suggests that the need for a new approach to Irish episcopal appointments may at last have penetrated to Rome. One no longer gets the impression of a self-confident Irish hierarchy flaunting its power. Quite the contrary. Even before the Irish bishops blundered into and through the paedophilia controversy, there were signs that they were already feeling unsure of themselves because of pressure on other fronts, both from liberal opinion but also, less publicly, from the extreme Catholic right. For I feel there may be truth in the stories we hear about complaints having been made to Rome by some right-wing lay Catholics about an alleged failure by Irish bishops to support more extreme lay positions. The refusal of the hierarchy in 1983 to meet my government when I invited them to discuss what had transpired to be the defective wording of a proposed constitutional amendment on abortion designed to prevent a Roe v. Wade development in Ireland, did not suggest to me as Taoiseach that the bishops were brimming with self-confidence. I felt it showed rather a fear that such a direct dialogue would face them with the fact there was a compelling legal case, that they could not, with intellectual honesty, resist for a change in the wording, acceptance of which might, however, have got them into trouble with the lay Catholic extreme right, and thus with Rome. Better to avoid such a troublesome dialogue, they seem to have felt. But by any standards, it was a mistake for the hierarchy to have asserted dogmatically at that time that the Attorney General was wrong in his belief that the proposed wording was open to misinterpretation. Constitutional law is not part of bishops' competence. This came back to hit them hard when their support for the defective wording contributed to a parliamentary majority defeating my government on the issue, and that wording being found defective 10 years later by the Supreme Court, exactly as the Attorney General had forecast and the bishops had denied, requiring several further constitutional amendments to sort the matter out, which have left everything very confused indeed at the end of the process. Whilst there are today some individual bishops in Ireland who certainly retain their moral authority because of their openness, it is difficult to avoid the impression that at least since the late 1960s, the criteria employed in selecting bishops has worked against the emergence of an Irish hierarchy of high intellectual capacity, capable of offering effective moral leadership to the Catholic clergy and laity of our island. Enda MacDonagh, one of Ireland's foremost theologians, has suggested that, I quote, a clean break with the Christendom mentality is necessary, bringing an end to clericalism, to the caste system of bishops, priests and religious with their power and privileges. They should rather, he suggests, be integrated into the believing community. This, of course, he went on to say, suggests that bishops be chosen, as in the past, by the believing community they are to serve, while confirmed in the unity of the whole Church by local bishops and by the Church's traditional symbol of universal unity, the Bishop of Rome. To some, that may sound revolutionary. It is, however, of course, the traditional view of the Church, a return to which was vigorously fought for by the papacy 1,000 years ago, at a time when many bishops, as well as being spiritual leaders, have become rulers of territories as feudal vassals of monarchs, a duality of episcopal roles that finally disappeared in Europe only